The Grand Monarch was the kind of restaurant where powerful people came to forget the rest of the world existed. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above white linen tables. Soft piano music floated through the air. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath a blanket of evening lights. Inside, deals worth millions of dollars were discussed over expensive wine and perfectly prepared steaks. For Madison Brooks, it was just another Friday night. Another long shift. Another evening spent smiling at strangers while worrying about bills she couldn't afford. She adjusted the tray balanced on one hand and moved between tables with practiced ease. After 3 years working at the Grand Monarch, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible. Customers remembered the food. They remembered the wine. Sometimes they remembered the manager. Rarely did they remember the waitress. And Madison preferred it that way. Invisible people heard things. Invisible people noticed things. Invisible people survived. Near the center of the dining room sat the restaurant's most important guest of the evening, Ethan Carver. Even people who never followed business news knew his name. Founder of Carver Capital. Owner of dozens of companies. A billionaire whose decisions could move markets around the world. The moment he entered the restaurant, the atmosphere changed. Managers stood straighter. Servers moved faster. Customers glanced in his direction. Power had a presence. And Ethan Carver carried it everywhere. Madison had served him before. He was always polite. Always calm. Always distant. The kind of man who looked through people rather than at them. She approached a nearby table carrying a bottle of Bordeaux. That was when she heard Russian. The sound caught her attention immediately. Not because it was unusual. New York was full of different languages. But because she understood every word. Years ago, before life forced her onto a different path, Madison had studied linguistics at Columbia University. Russian had been one of her strongest languages. Almost nobody knew that anymore. These days she was simply a waitress. Nothing more. The voices came from a booth near the back of the restaurant. 2 men. Well-dressed. Quiet. Careful. The kind of customers nobody noticed twice. Madison continued walking while listening. At first, the conversation sounded ordinary. Then she heard something that made her slow down. South window. A pause. Then another voice. Perfect angle. Madison's grip tightened around the bottle. The first man checked his watch. Less than 5 minutes. The second nodded. Clear shot. A chill ran through her body. She told herself there had to be another explanation. Maybe they were discussing security. Maybe they were talking about a movie. Maybe she was imagining things. Then she heard a name. Ethan Carver. Every doubt disappeared. Madison looked toward the billionaire's table. He sat laughing with 2 executives. Completely unaware. Completely exposed. The men continued speaking. One described a building across the street. The other mentioned timing. Distances. Angles. Everything sounded wrong. Dangerously wrong. Madison's heart began pounding. Nobody else seemed to notice. The piano continued playing. Guests continued eating. Servers continued working. The entire restaurant carried on as if nothing was happening. Because nobody else understood what she was hearing. The 2 men stood up. One adjusted his jacket. The other headed calmly toward the exit. Neither looked nervous. Neither looked rushed. And somehow that terrified Madison even more. She glanced toward security. No reaction. Toward management. No concern. Toward Ethan Carver. Still laughing. Still unaware. For a brief moment, Madison considered doing nothing. After all, what if she was wrong? What if nobody believed her? What if she embarrassed herself in front of the most powerful man in the room? Then another thought appeared. What if she was right? Her stomach tightened. Because if she was right, someone was about to die. Madison slowly set the wine bottle onto a nearby service station, took a deep breath, and started walking toward Ethan Carver's table. Fast, because somewhere outside the restaurant, a clock was already counting down, and she was running out of time. Madison Brooks hadn't always planned to spend her nights carrying trays through crowded dining rooms. 5 years earlier, her life had looked very different. Back then, she had been a student. A good one. Professors praised her work. Classmates asked for her notes. She spoke 3 languages fluently and was learning a 4th. Her dream was simple. She wanted to become an interpreter, to travel, to work with people from different cultures, to build a future that stretched far beyond the limits of her neighborhood in Queens. Then life happened. It started with a phone call she never forgot. A doctor, a diagnosis, a frightened younger brother sitting in a hospital room pretending to be brave. Everything changed after that. College became impossible. Medical bills arrived faster than paychecks. Her mother worked whenever she could, but it was never enough. Someone had to make sacrifices, and Madison made hers without complaint. She left school halfway through her third year, took the first job she could find, then a second one, then overtime whenever it was available. Every month became a balancing act between rent, medication, food, and hope. Some months she won. Some months she barely survived. Yet she never regretted her choice. Not when she looked at Dylan. Not when she saw him smile. Not when he pretended not to notice how exhausted she was. That smile made everything worth it. Even the hardest days. Especially the hardest days. Tonight should have been one of those ordinary difficult days. A long shift. A tired drive home. A few hours of sleep. Then another day all over again. Instead, she found herself walking toward the most powerful man in the restaurant with a warning nobody else could understand. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. The closer she got to Ethan Carver's table, the more ridiculous the situation felt. Who was going to believe her? A waitress claiming she overheard a threat in Russian. A waitress interrupting a billionaire's dinner. A waitress asking everyone to trust her instincts. The idea sounded absurd, even to her. Yet the memory of those two men refused to leave her mind. The way they spoke, the confidence in their voices, the exact details they mentioned. None of it felt accidental. None of it felt harmless. Madison slowed as she approached the table. Ethan was still speaking with two executives. They were discussing an acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Numbers larger than anything she could imagine. The conversation paused as she stepped closer. One of the executives frowned immediately. "Can we help you?" Madison swallowed. For a moment, every eye at the table turned toward her, including Ethan's. His expression remained calm, patient, curious, but distant. The expression of a man accustomed to people wanting something from him. Madison glanced around. The restaurant remained peaceful. No one else seemed concerned. No one else had any reason to be. She took a breath, then another. Finally she spoke. "Mr. Carver, I think you're in danger." The executives exchanged glances. One almost laughed. The other rolled his eyes. But Ethan continued watching her. Silent. Waiting. Madison knew she had only one chance. One chance to convince him. One chance to make him listen. And somewhere beyond the restaurant windows, the clock was still ticking. Madison immediately knew she had made a mistake. Not because she was wrong. Because nobody at the table believed her. The executive on Ethan's left leaned back in his chair and let out a small laugh. "In danger?" Another shook his head. "I'm sorry, miss, but Mr. Carver's security team handles those matters." Madison felt heat rising into her cheeks. This was exactly what she had expected. Still, she forced herself to continue. "I overheard two men speaking Russian." The first executive smirked. "And you speak Russian?" "Yes." That answer finally caught Ethan's attention. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not with fear, with curiosity. Madison continued. They were discussing a location across the street. Nobody spoke. She could feel dozens of eyes from nearby tables drifting toward them. The attention made her uncomfortable. But she kept going. They mentioned a south-facing window. One executive checked his watch impatiently. The other looked ready to dismiss her entirely. Only Ethan remained silent. Watching. Listening. Evaluating. The same way successful investors evaluated risk. Madison swallowed. They also mentioned your name. The atmosphere shifted slightly. Not much, but enough for her to notice. The executives stopped smiling. Security, standing several feet away, glanced toward the table. Ethan folded his hands. What exactly did they say? For the first time since approaching the table, Madison felt a small sense of relief. At least he was listening now. They discussed timing. She paused. Less than 5 minutes. The executive nearest Ethan sighed. "Mr. Carver, this is ridiculous." "I agree," another added. Someone probably overheard part of a conversation and misunderstood. Madison knew how absurd she sounded. If their positions were reversed, she might have reacted the same way. But she also knew what she heard. Uncertainty was a difficult thing to ignore. Ethan studied her face. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then he asked a question she wasn't expecting. "Why warn me?" Madison blinked. "What?" Most people would walk away. His voice remained calm, measured. "So why take the risk?" The answer came naturally. "Because it was true. Because if something happened and I stayed silent." She hesitated. "I wouldn't be able to live with myself." Something flickered across Ethan's expression. Respect perhaps. Or surprise. It disappeared so quickly she wasn't sure she had seen it at all. One of the executives stood. With all due respect, Mr. Carver, we have a meeting in 20 minutes. Another nodded. This woman is obviously mistaken. Ethan remained seated, his gaze still fixed on Madison. Then, slowly, he offered a small smile. Not mocking, not dismissive, polite. The kind people used when ending uncomfortable conversations. Thank you for your concern. Madison's heart sank immediately. She recognized the tone. The conversation was over. He didn't believe her. Not really. Maybe part of him wanted to. Maybe part of him respected her sincerity. But belief required evidence. And she had none. Only instinct. Only words. Only fear. Madison nodded quietly. Of course. Then she stepped away from the table. The executives immediately resumed their discussion. Numbers. Investments. Schedules. The world returned to normal. At least for them. For Madison, nothing felt normal anymore. She walked toward the service station and forced herself to continue working. A customer requested another bottle of wine. Someone asked for dessert menus. Another wanted fresh coffee. She handled each request automatically. But her attention kept drifting toward the windows, toward the buildings across the street, toward the darkness beyond the glass. Then something caught her eye. A reflection. Tiny. Brief. Almost invisible. A flash of light from a distant building. Madison froze. Every sound around her seemed to disappear. The piano. The conversations. The clinking glasses. All gone. Only one thought remained. The men were telling the truth. And suddenly, she realized there were no longer 5 minutes left. There were only seconds. Madison couldn't look away. The reflection appeared again. A tiny flash from a dark office building across the street. Then it disappeared. To everyone else, it meant nothing. To Madison, it meant everything. Her breath caught in her throat. The words she had overheard echoed inside her mind. South window. Perfect angle. Less than 5 minutes. Clear shot. Suddenly, every piece fit together. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out there. Right now? Waiting. Madison turned toward Ethan's table. The billionaire was still seated exactly where he had been moments earlier. Relaxed. Focused on business. Completely unaware. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind him offered a perfect view of Manhattan, and a perfect line of sight from the building across the street. Her heart slammed against her chest. She looked toward security. The guards remained near the entrance, talking quietly, distracted. No one had noticed anything. No one was looking in the right direction. For a fraction of a second, Madison froze. Fear wrapped itself around her like ice. What if she was wrong? What if she embarrassed herself? What if she tackled a billionaire in the middle of a restaurant for no reason? The questions came fast. But another thought arrived, even faster. What if she did nothing? The answer terrified her. Because if she was right, someone was about to die. The flash appeared again. This time she saw it clearly. A brief glint. Metal. Movement. Then instinct took over. Madison dropped the order pad she was holding. It hit the floor with a sharp crack. Several customers looked up. She didn't notice. Didn't care. Her feet were already moving. Fast. Then faster. The distance between her and Ethan suddenly felt impossible. Every second stretched. Every step felt too slow. Someone called her name. She didn't stop. A server stepped into her path. She moved around him. A customer pushed back a chair. She nearly collided with it. Still she kept running. The entire restaurant seemed to blur around her. All she could see was Ethan Carver. Still seated. Still vulnerable. Still unaware. One of his executives looked up. Confusion crossed his face. Why was the waitress running? Why was she heading toward them? Madison heard someone shout. Then another voice. Then security finally reacted. Too late. Much too late. The reflection exploded inside the darkness across the street. A bright flash. A violent spark. And in that instant, Madison knew. There was no time left. No warning left to give. No chance left for explanations. Only action. With every ounce of strength she had, Madison launched herself toward Ethan Carver. The billionaire looked up just as she reached him. Confusion filled his eyes. For a split second, their gazes met. Then Madison slammed into him. The force knocked both of them sideways. The chair tipped backward. Glasses crashed to the floor. Executives shouted. Customers screamed. And a fraction of a second later, the restaurant windows exploded. The sound was deafening. Glass burst inward like a wave of crystal rain. Thousands of sharp fragments filled the air. People dropped to the floor. Tables overturned. The pianist disappeared beneath his instrument. Chaos erupted everywhere. Madison felt something strike her shoulder. A burning pain unlike anything she had ever experienced. Her breath vanished. For a moment, the world became white. Then silence. Heavy. Ringing. Endless. She was lying on top of Ethan Carver. Shielding him. Protecting him. And only then did the billionaire finally understand. The waitress hadn't been crazy. The waitress hadn't been mistaken. The waitress had just saved his life. And she had paid for it with blood. The first thing Ethan Carver noticed was the weight. Someone was lying across him. Protecting him. Shielding him from the storm of shattered glass still falling around them. For several seconds, he couldn't process what had happened. The world had become noise. Screams. Breaking glass. Shouting. The sharp ringing inside his ears. Then his vision cleared. And he saw Madison. The waitress. Her body was draped across his. One hand pressed against the floor. The other clutching his jacket. Blood stained the sleeve of her uniform. Bright red against white fabric. Ethan stared. His mind refused to accept what he was seeing. Only moments earlier, she had been serving tables. Now she was bleeding because she had tried to save him. Madison. Someone shouted her name. Security rushed toward them. Several customers were crouched beneath tables. Others were running for the exits. Restaurant staff scrambled to help the injured. The elegant dining room had transformed into chaos. Ethan barely noticed any of it. His attention remained fixed on Madison. She winced as she tried to move. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. The sound hit him harder than he expected. "Don't move." The words left his mouth before he realized he had spoken. Madison looked at him. Her face had turned pale. Yet somehow she still managed a weak smile. "You should probably listen to your own advice." Ethan blinked. Even now she was trying to make a joke. The absurdity of it almost stunned him. A security guard dropped to his knees beside them. "We need medical assistance immediately." Another spoke urgently into a radio. Across the room, someone was calling emergency services. Everything happened at once. Yet Ethan barely heard any of it. His eyes remained on the growing stain spreading across Madison's shoulder. Blood. Because of him. The realization settled heavily inside his chest. If she hadn't moved, if she hadn't acted, he would be the one lying there. Not her. Him. The thought was impossible to ignore. For years, Ethan had lived surrounded by security. Drivers. Bodyguards. Private protection teams. People were paid to keep him safe. Yet when danger finally arrived, the person who reacted first wasn't security, wasn't law enforcement, wasn't one of his executives. It was a waitress, a young woman nobody in the room had taken seriously, including him. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt much longer. They carefully examined Madison's shoulder. One medic looked relieved. "She's lucky." Lucky. The words sounded strange considering the amount of blood. "A large piece of glass," the medic explained. "Painful, but it missed anything critical." Several people around them exhaled, including Ethan, a reaction he hadn't expected. Only then did he realize how tense he had become. Madison closed her eyes briefly. Exhaustion was beginning to replace adrenaline. Everything that had happened was finally catching up to her. The paramedics prepared a stretcher. As they helped her onto it, she glanced toward Ethan. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Madison managed a quiet question. "You're okay?" Ethan stared at her. She was injured. She was the one being taken to the hospital. And somehow she was asking about him. The question left him speechless. All he could do was nod. Madison smiled faintly, satisfied with the answer. Then the paramedics wheeled her away. Ethan watched until she disappeared through the restaurant doors. Only after she was gone did he notice something unusual. The dining room had fallen silent. Every eye was on him. Executives, customers, staff, all staring. Not at the billionaire. Not at the attack. At the empty space where the waitress had been moments earlier. Because everyone in the room understood the same thing. Without Madison Brooks, Ethan Carver would not have walked out of that restaurant alive. And for the first time in many years, the billionaire found himself asking a question he couldn't answer. Who exactly was Madison Brooks? The hospital was unusually quiet after midnight. The emergency rush had slowed. The hallways were nearly empty. Most visitors had gone home hours earlier. Ethan Carver remained. He sat alone in a chair outside Madison's room, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His assistant had offered to drive him home. His security chief had suggested relocating to a safer location. His board members had called repeatedly. Ethan ignored all of them. For the first time in years, none of those things seemed important. A waitress had risked her life to save his, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. The door to Madison's room finally opened. A doctor stepped out carrying a chart. "She's awake." Ethan stood immediately. The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "The injury looks worse than it is. She lost blood, but she'll recover." A weight Ethan hadn't realized he was carrying suddenly lifted. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded. "Just for a few minutes." Ethan thanked him and stepped inside. The room was softly lit. Machines beeped quietly in the background. Madison lay against white pillows. Her shoulder was heavily bandaged. She looked exhausted, but alive. When she noticed Ethan standing near the door, surprise crossed her face. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Madison smiled faintly. "I guess the hospital food isn't good enough to keep billionaires away." Ethan actually laughed. A genuine laugh. The first one he'd had all night. Apparently not. Madison relaxed slightly. The silence that followed felt strangely comfortable. Neither seemed in a hurry to break it. Finally, Ethan pulled a chair closer. "You saved my life." The words sounded simple, but they carried more weight than any speech he had ever given. Madison looked down, almost embarrassed. "I just reacted." "No." Ethan shook his head. "You made a choice." She didn't answer, because deep down she knew he was right. She had made a choice. A dangerous one. A frightening one. And she would probably make the same choice again. Ethan studied her for a moment. The question had been bothering him ever since the restaurant. A question nobody else seemed able to answer. Why? Madison looked up. Why what? Why risk your life for someone you've never met? The room fell quiet. Outside, distant footsteps echoed down the hallway. Inside, only the steady beeping of the monitor remained. Madison considered the question carefully. Then she shrugged. A small movement. Simple. Honest. Because someone had to. Ethan stared at her, waiting for more. There wasn't any. No dramatic explanation. No speech. No hidden motive. Just those 4 words. Because someone had to. The simplicity of the answer hit him harder than he expected. His entire life had been built around strategy, calculation, risk assessment. People usually wanted something. Money, connections, opportunities, influence. There was always a reason, always a benefit. Yet sitting in front of him was a woman who had nearly died for a complete stranger and seemed genuinely confused by the attention. As if saving a life were the obvious thing to do. As if courage required no explanation. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan felt humbled. Not by another billionaire. Not by a competitor. Not by a politician. By a waitress. Madison shifted slightly and winced. The movement reminded Ethan she was still recovering. You should rest. A small smile appeared on her face. That's probably the smartest thing anyone said all day. Ethan stood, then paused near the door. Something inside him refused to leave without saying one more thing. He turned back toward her. Madison. Yeah. His voice became quieter, more sincere than she expected. Thank you. Madison looked at him for several seconds, then smiled. A real smile this time. Warm, gentle, almost effortless. You're welcome, Mr. Carver. Ethan nodded, then walked out into the hallway. But as he headed toward the elevators, one thought followed him. He knew everything about markets, everything about companies, everything about power. Yet somehow, he knew absolutely nothing about the woman who had just changed his life. And for the first time, he wanted to find out. 3 days later, Ethan Carver found himself doing something he almost never did. Investigating someone for personal reasons. Normally, background reports landed on his desk because of business deals. Potential partners, executives, competitors, people worth millions, people who controlled companies, people who influenced markets. Madison Brooks controlled none of those things. Yet her file sat alone on his desk, and somehow it felt more important than any acquisition report he had reviewed that month. Ethan opened the folder. The first page looked ordinary. Age, 24. Current occupation, waitress. Residence, Queens. No criminal record. No unusual financial activity. Nothing remarkable. At least not at first glance. Then he kept reading, and the story began to change. Madison had attended Columbia University on an academic scholarship. Top grades. Outstanding language aptitude. Fluent in English, Russian, and Spanish. Several professors had described her as one of the most promising students in the program. Ethan leaned back. A scholarship student. Columbia. Linguistics. Suddenly, her understanding of Russian made perfect sense. But one question remained. Why had someone with that future ended up serving tables? The answer appeared 2 pages later. Medical records. Family hardship. Withdrawal from university. Employment history beginning almost immediately afterward. Ethan's expression slowly changed. Madison hadn't failed. She hadn't given up. She had sacrificed. There was a difference. A very big difference. He continued reading. Every new page seemed to reveal another layer of her life. Double shifts. Night work. Part-time weekend jobs. Years spent helping support her younger brother. Years spent putting someone else's future ahead of her own. Ethan stared at the file. The numbers alone told a story. A difficult one. A story of responsibilities arriving far too early. Most people in her situation would have become bitter, angry, resentful. Instead, she had somehow remained kind enough to risk her life for a stranger. That was the part Ethan couldn't stop thinking about. The door opened. His assistant entered carrying a tablet. You wanted the rest of the information. Ethan nodded. She handed it over. Her brother's condition is serious. His eyes moved across the screen. Hospital visits. Specialists. Treatment plans. Expenses. A staggering amount for any family, especially one surviving on a waitress's income. How long? Several years. Ethan looked away from the tablet. Several years. Madison had been carrying that burden for several years. And somehow nobody at the restaurant seemed to know. Nobody knew she had once been a scholarship student. Nobody knew she spoke multiple languages. Nobody knew she spent her free time caring for her brother. To everyone around her, she was simply a waitress. Invisible. The realization bothered him more than it should have. Because Ethan suddenly remembered something. The night of the attack. Everyone had ignored her warning. Management. Security. His executives. Even him. Not because she was wrong. Because of who she appeared to be. A waitress. Nothing more. The thought sat heavily in his chest. For the first time, Ethan wondered how many extraordinary people the world overlooked every day. How many dreams disappeared behind uniforms. How many stories remained untold because nobody bothered to ask. His phone buzzed. A board member calling. Ethan ignored it. The file remained open before him. Near the bottom of the final page sat a recent photograph. Madison standing beside her younger brother. Both smiling. Both pretending life was easier than it really was. Ethan found himself staring at the image longer than necessary. Then he made a decision. A simple one, but important. He closed the folder, stood from his desk, and picked up his car keys. Because for the first time since the attack, he knew exactly what he wanted to do next. He wasn't going to send money. He wasn't going to write a check. And he definitely wasn't going to offer charity. Madison Brooks would never accept that. Instead, he was going to offer something much more valuable. A second chance. Even if she refused it. Even if she argued. Even if she walked away. Because after learning her story, Ethan understood something clearly. The waitress who saved his life had given up her future for someone she loved. And he intended to help her get it back. A week later, Madison returned to work. Against her doctor's advice. Against common sense. And definitely against Ethan Carver's expectations. The bandage beneath her uniform still covered most of her shoulder. Every movement reminded her that she wasn't fully healed. But medical bills didn't care about recovery. Rent didn't pause because someone got injured. Life kept moving. So Madison moved with it. The dinner rush had just begun when the restaurant manager appeared. Beside her, Madison. She looked up. Someone's asking for you. Who? The manager smiled nervously. You're about to find out. Confused, Madison followed him toward one of the private dining rooms. When the door opened, she stopped walking. Ethan Carver stood inside. Alone. No executives. No security team. No assistants. Just him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan smiled. I'm beginning to think you don't know how to take time off. Madison laughed softly. I'm beginning to think billionaires have too much free time. To her surprise, Ethan laughed. The tension immediately eased. He motioned toward the chair across from him. Sit. Madison hesitated, then sat. A folder rested on the table between them. She immediately became suspicious. What is that? Ethan leaned back. An opportunity. Madison narrowed her eyes. That sounds dangerous. It probably is. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan slid the folder toward her. Reluctantly, she opened it. The first page made her freeze. Columbia University. Her former university. The place she had left years ago. The place she had tried not to think about. The place connected to a future she once believed was gone forever. Madison slowly turned another page. Then another. And another. Scholarship information. Academic reinstatement. Flexible scheduling options. Programs she had once dreamed about. Her throat tightened. What is this? Ethan answered quietly. A way back. Madison immediately closed the folder. No. The response came so quickly, even she seemed surprised. Ethan remained calm. I haven't finished. You don't need to. She pushed the folder back toward him. I can't accept this. Why? The question sounded genuine. Not argumentative. Just curious. Madison looked away. Because the answer wasn't simple. Pride. Fear. Habit. Years of surviving alone had taught her one lesson. Nothing came for free. Nothing. I don't want charity. The words hung between them. Ethan nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. Then he leaned forward. This isn't charity. Madison said nothing. He continued. Charity is when someone helps because they feel sorry for you. She met his eyes. And this isn't. That. No. His voice remained steady. This is an investment. The room fell quiet. Madison stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or argue. Ethan smiled slightly. The night of the attack, everyone in that restaurant overlooked the smartest person in the room. Madison shook her head. That's not true. It is. He tapped the folder gently. You sacrificed your education for your family. You learn languages most people never bother learning. You saw danger nobody else noticed. Then his expression softened. And you saved my life. Madison looked down, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. She had never viewed herself the way Ethan did. To her, she had simply made a choice. Nothing more. Nothing heroic. Ethan watched her quietly, then spoke the words she never expected to hear. The world has already taken enough from you. Madison felt something shift inside her. A small crack in the wall she had spent years building. Not because of the opportunity. Not because of the university. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone saw the sacrifices she had made. Someone understood what they had cost. And for a moment, neither of them noticed that their conversation was about much more than college. It was about possibility. About second chances. About futures people thought were gone. As Madison looked at the folder again, a question formed in her mind. One she wasn't quite ready to answer. But for the first time in years, she was no longer certain the answer was no. Several months later, life looked very different for Madison Brooks. Not perfect, not easy, but different. For the first time in years, she wasn't constantly running just to stay in place. The scholarship program had allowed her to return to Columbia University part-time. The schedule wasn't simple. Classes during the day, work in the evenings, hospital visits whenever her brother needed them. Some weeks felt impossible, but Madison no longer felt trapped. She felt hopeful, and hope was a powerful thing. Dylan's condition had also begun to improve. New treatment options became available. Doctors who had once sounded uncertain now spoke with cautious optimism. For Madison, hearing those words was worth more than money, more than success, more than anything. One bright autumn morning, Ethan Carver stood backstage at a charity event organized by the Carver Foundation. The ballroom was filled with students, educators, business leaders, and journalists. Large screens displayed the foundation's newest initiative, a scholarship program for students forced to leave school because of financial hardship. Students exactly like Madison. When the host stepped onto the stage, applause filled the room. Several names were introduced. Several stories were shared. Then the host spoke one name that immediately captured the audience's attention. Madison Brooks. The room erupted into applause. Madison froze. She hated being the center of attention. Always had. Yet there was no escape. Smiling nervously, she walked toward the stage. The applause grew louder. Some people recognized her immediately. Others recognized the story. The waitress who had saved a billionaire's life. The young woman who had sacrificed her future for her family. The quiet hero nobody had noticed until it mattered. Madison reached the stage and accepted the award. The audience remained standing. Many were smiling. Some were visibly emotional. Madison glanced toward Ethan. He stood near the front row, applauding along with everyone else. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Neither needed to say anything. They both remembered the night that had changed everything. The shattered glass, the fear, the hospital room, the conversation that followed. One decision had connected two lives that should never have crossed paths. When the applause finally settled, Ethan was invited to speak. The billionaire stepped to the microphone. The room immediately fell silent. For years, people had listened whenever Ethan Carver spoke about business, about investing, about success. This time was different. His gaze moved toward Madison, then across the audience. In my life, I've met brilliant people. The room listened carefully. I've met powerful people. A pause. I've met people wealthier than most nations. A few people laughed softly. Then Ethan's expression became serious. But courage. He paused again. Courage is much rarer. The ballroom became completely silent. Because courage appears when there is nothing to gain. His eyes returned to Madison. And sometimes the bravest person in the room isn't the one everyone notices. Madison immediately recognized the sentence. It echoed something both of them had learned. Something neither would ever forget. The audience rose to its feet once more. Applause thundered throughout the ballroom. Madison lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the attention. Exactly as she always did. Because despite everything that had happened, despite the recognition, despite the awards, despite the headlines, she still saw herself the same way. A sister, a student, a waitress who happened to make a choice. Nothing more. And perhaps that was why people admired her. Not because she had saved a billionaire, but because she never believed she was extraordinary for doing so. As the applause continued around her, Madison smiled quietly. The future remained uncertain. There would still be challenges, still be sacrifices, still be difficult days ahead. But for the first time in a long time, she was looking forward instead of simply surviving. And somewhere deep inside, she understood a simple truth. Sometimes a single moment can change a life. Sometimes it can change many. And sometimes the people who make the biggest difference are the ones nobody notices until the very moment they choose to be brave. The quiet ones are never truly ordinary.